Hi, thanks for joining us. We'd like to share with you just some of the conversation we've had around why producing this series is so important to us, why we feel that touch and manual cueing is such an important topic in our community right now. So again, I'm joined by Ann Bishop and Mercy Sidbury, and I suppose that the question we would like to pose or to talk about is just what was the impetus? The impetus for each of us for putting ourselves in this situation and getting this information out there in a way that perhaps we think is not happening. For me, the original idea came from wanting to balance the verbal cueing forum that we have on Skillful Teaching with something that is what we do all the time in the studio, which is balance our verbal cueing with manual cueing. And as a teacher of teachers, you see so often that it feels difficult to find time and room for the manual piece, for talking about that beyond kind of the basic safety elements. But for me, there's just always this great desire to infuse the teaching with that, because for me, I don't know how to teach without touching. So that's my own personal motivation. And then just feeling like teaching teachers is a huge responsibility. And if I didn't include something that was relevant to touch, I felt like I was doing a disservice to the community in terms of, putting teachers out there who didn't know how to touch. How do you teach without touching? That's, I guess, the ultimate question for me.
And one of the reasons that I was very excited about your project is that I have, in the last numbers of years, realized how critical that piece of information that comes from touch and from the dialogue between an instruction and the response in the client. I see what happens, but I also feel very deeply what happens, and I realize that over time I've developed my touch so that I can feel more deeply than I can see.
Yeah.
And it feels like that piece for me would be, if I could not use that, there would be just such a lack. And so I really appreciate your wanting to find out how's the best way, what are the stepping stones for introducing this to people for whom this is a, there's nothing in the manuals about touching.
Right.
There's lots about the cueing and about what you're looking for and all that, but there isn't very much guidance to how to touch.
And I was just reading some research that they've been doing in the last couple of years around touch and refining the research data around our ability to express multiple complex emotions through touch more quickly and more effectively than we can verbally. And I just think that's a fascinating and a compelling argument for how crucial touch is in addition to language, right?
That makes me actually think of the perspective when we first learn movement and we're actually babies, right? And babies don't speak. Babies sense and feel touch, right?
What's the first sense that develops in the human?
Right.
In the human is touch.
So I think that perhaps that's why we are able to convey so much information so quickly, is because of that touch. And we also know if babies aren't touched, sadly, they actually die.
Right.
There's also been research on that.
Yeah.
So obviously touch is very important to the human body and spirit.
It is a progressive path, and in terms of the Pilates paradigm, really looking at what is the framework, what's our scope of practice, how and why do we touch within the Pilates paradigm, that we do have a responsibility to share what we feel like is powerful in terms of teaching.
And possible.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because I think there's a lot of, I can just imagine going back and being a beginning teacher and, knowing that words can't do it all.
Yeah.
And yet, what do you start with? And so I feel like it's, I love the way you've broken down all the different kinds and uses for touch in our scope of practice. That I also think there's a reason that people go off and do trainings so that they can get more facile with it and have more license to do different kinds of touch.
Right.
And there's so many different ways that Pilates practitioners have integrated other forms into their practice. And I really believe that's partly why.
Yeah.
I mean, it's partly to understand why the body's moving in a particular way and what factors are issues around why we can't get a perfectly neutral spine on everyone or something like that.
It reminds me of some of the pictures too, the early pictures you see of Joseph Pilates. Like, he's frequently touching someone, I think in most of the pictures. So I think that really
frequently, roughly touching
or standing on them, right? So I think that goes back to really even the heart of Pilates, and why it is so important that we do really have a conversation about it, and also share and teach people what we've picked up over the years.
Absolutely. We started to have an interesting conversation at some point in the planning of the series around scope of practice. And I want to talk about it only because I want to demonstrate how different each of us can hold our own scope of practice, right? And for the three of us, just our varying opinions that are often lining up and sometimes divergent from one another's. So maybe just to talk about that a little bit, I was looking at the Pilates Method Alliance scope of practice recently in regards to touch, and of course was glad to see that touch is there, but it's also very vague, right? And so it's like you see that it's an important piece, and yet who's helping you decide what's appropriate and not appropriate? So there are guidelines like what is within the scope is to always ask permission, and to touch for very specific reasons like informing movement and to keep a student safe. And then what's outside of the scope is to not touch inappropriately. And it feels like, who helps me sort that out? Like, who helps me figure that out? And I have come up with, based on our conversation, a basic scope of practice that we share in terms of touching, which we go into more in the introduction.
Well, when I think about touch, obviously, and aligning that with what you mentioned about the PMA, is obviously there's touch for safety. We're sitting here on a Cadillac. I imagine, someone doing, spread eagle on the Cadillac or something, or, and obviously you want some protective touch there. And that's almost more like a spotting.
Sure.
So then there's that framework. And then I think for me, I generally use touch as an informative means for the student. And I try to couple that by drawing their attention to the touch. So I'm doing two things. I'm touching the student, and then I'm also making sure that they're aware of where I'm touching them, and also potentially, and usually helpfully, why I'm touching them. And so I think that there's three things going on. You're touching, and you're being clear about the where, and you're also being clear about the why. And that can be a quick thing. It doesn't have to be a paragraph.
Right.
Obviously, you want to get people moving.
Sure.
I feel like my history of working in a hospital where there are very specific scope of practice guidelines for what appropriate touch is, it was almost more limiting than what even you might see in a Pilates studio, because we worked inside of a medical model. There were physical therapists who did a particular kind of work that we were to steer away from. So even in the sense of assisting someone in a stretch, I am very aware when I would like to assist in a way of moving forward, and I try to get the person to work more actively and me support them in the position.
So could you give an example of what would be inappropriate touch from the hospital model that they told you?
Well, honestly, if we were, if you had someone on the end of the trap table and you were doing a psoas stretch with them, you could position and keep the pelvis so that it was more posteriorly tilted, so to protect the spine, and then the legs draping off the end. It's inappropriate to push down on it. It's okay to place your hand there and have them move their leg up into your hand and create a resisted stretch.
I appreciate that you asked the specific question too, because I think when I'm looking at my own, guidelines, this has come up a lot for me in terms of where does the edge come, for most of us. And in the scope of practice that we have kind of defined, it manipulation as outside of our scope of practice. And I start to think about that more and more, and even that starts to get a little fuzzy. I love the way you're talking about it, because I think that is where we can cross the line, right? By not just hands-on in terms of assisting, particularly in a stretch, I think is where we get where it gets a bit nebulous. Somebody showed us something on our own body that's felt delicious and we want to pass it on, and yet are we really asking ourselves what is appropriate? I start to think to myself, how would I define if I'm manipulating a body or not? And to me, I start to think, well, it feels like if I am verbally and through my other cueing, getting a body to do it themselves and guiding them towards the outcome, right, or the position, and then hands-on to assist or stabilize, that's appropriate. I think about, is the body participating? Is this an active participation in them? And am I facilitating, or am I actually manipulating and moving the body myself without that body participating? Which I think perhaps that's not the clearest definition, but for me, I start to think that's maybe the tipping point. That's the scope for me.
I love that distinction of what they can participate with, because I think that's really it presupposes a particular kind of neurological pathway already there. That it says, oh, I didn't know I had that extra space in my spine that I could lengthen down through. But if if there's a resistance, just on the basis of not having ever done it before, the body, you can sort of feel that. And what you say, it's like really hard to translate. What is that feeling? Well, I think that's where, because we're in this field, because we've all benefited from it, we can translate our own experiences into, oh, I know that resistance. I know what that feels like. I know the imposition of something beyond where I am. We're not together in this offering, because that's what I feel like is a big part of where, even if it isn't introducing a new little track of the possibilities of movement, it's like, if we're really together, the client and the teacher, we can go there together, because it's already safe. We're open to it. We're open to newness.
Well, I think you really hit on a key point there, is because I feel like as a movement teacher, we really want to teach our students to fish. We just don't want to give them fish, right? So when you do that, you're actually teaching them something. And something that has been taught or something that has been learned is repeatable and can be repeated, but repeated in a new context. So, can someone perform spinal articulation in a bridge versus can they perform spinal articulation in a roll down? And so I think touch has that great way of facilitating that. And I think that is a nice distinction to say that, is touch allowing the student or the client to learn the move, or is it more of a passive sort of, here's a great stretch, let me push on you?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Which to me, something we talk a lot, or have been recently talking a lot about in the Skillful Teaching Forum, is student-centered teaching. And to me, this lines up perfectly, because, we watch the level of success in our students. And my own experience is if the information doesn't come from them, an innate exploration or embodiment, then the likelihood that they can replicate it is so dim and so low. But if this relationship is established and it is open and it is a constant agreement, and we are feeding off and guiding based on the feedback we're getting, then we can, like you said, we can teach them how to fish. We can draw out of them the information that they need to re-educate their bodies. This is a starting point, and then I think, again, what's exciting is it just opens us up to so many more conversations, and for each of us to really look at what's important to us, to hold true in terms of our own touch and our own manual cueing.